It's all fertile, as you guys say. Yeah.
Welcome to this new cyclic episode with Adnan Husain. So Adnan is associate history professor somewhere in the province of Turtle Island known as Ontario, probably Kingston if memory serves. So Adnan, I'm so happy to have you on the show. At last, I was going to say, because when we first thought of doing Resistance is Fertile, we did a few pilot episodes, and you were one of the persons we approached, and I must say you were one of the sweetest, most supportive voices out there, and I really approached you out of the blue, so that counted for a lot. In fact, you're responsible for everything we're doing, and it's all your fault. Or something like that.
Glad to know it.
So I've been.
Your lawyer told you that as well? I thought that was just my lawyer.
Yeah, I know. We need to deflect responsibility. We're taking cues from the Zionist colony to deflect, and project is the way we go about things. But also, you're an extremely interesting thinker, thinking in directions that I knew very little about, I have to say, like the historical roots of Islamophobia in the Crusades, in this very old formation. I kind of stopped at thinking racism and capitalism was a brew made around the time of the Industrial Revolution, but clearly the roots go much deeper, and you've got a really interesting take on this, which I'd love to discuss today. And another fascinating podcast I listened with you was, I think, on guerrilla history, where you discussed the integration of Islam and Marxism. And that's a subject that's very dear to my heart, because I've been following Palestine and, in Palestine solidarity in one way or another since 1981. And at the time, the majority of the pro-Palestine movement and the Palestinian movement was secular, Marxist, but things have changed a lot today, and it's interesting to think about those different aspects. And you're one of those people that seem to find no contradiction between a very detailed Marxist, maybe even Marxist-Leninist analysis and Islamic faith. And so I would just love to pick your brain and hear you speak about all those things, in addition to whatever else you feel you want to speak about today.
Well, firstly, I want to thank you so much, both you, Benji, and Sasha, for inviting me on. I really enjoy Resistance is Fertile, and I was really honored to apparently have some role in encouraging you to make this wonderful podcast and show that I know has been helping many people to really go deeper into some of the psychological and intense internal understandings of both how to process the horrific genocide and just the terrible world that we confront geopolitically, but also on a daily basis, given that many of, I think, your listeners, are based in settler colonial societies or Western states, where there has been such a studied effort to try and isolate people from one another, isolate them from reality, from what's happening, to ignore it, to act as if it's not happening. And that's almost the most maddening thing for me on a daily basis, is how life can go on in such a normal fashion by people. I have the privilege, but it's maybe a burden, of working with so many people who are well-educated, seem very well-intentioned, committed people to the institution that they're part of, to their professional lives, who nonetheless seem, completely divorced from what's actually happening in the world. So your podcast and your work has been really valuable for me on a variety of levels. So thank you so much. It's an honor to join you. Those were a lot of topics, and it's true that I've been a guest on a few shows, and as co-host of Guerrilla History with my friend and comrade Henry Hakamaki. We've been doing for several years podcasts on history as a resource for our struggles for justice and liberation, and how history might be meaningful and matters. And as a historian myself, that's an approach I tried to take in my own work, which I have to say now it seems so impossible to maintain a commitment to the institution. I'm at Queen's University, but even the academy as a whole, and having to fight struggles inside the university just for its survival in this neoliberal corporatized environment of austerity and budget cuts. But I feel like, why would I want to invest in these corrupt colonial institutions? It's taking all my time to try and keep our history program going, keep our school of religion going. And it's like, this is such fruitless. It's necessary, it's important, but it's also globally, why do I want to defend, institutions and try and maintain institutions that are themselves complicit in the genocide, are contributing to a kind of historical amnesia about our own colonial conditions while deflecting from the reality of the world around us. I just saw yesterday, and I was so excited to see that in response to Francesca Albanese's recent report on the economy of occupation to economy of genocide, talking about all of the various institutions and corporate profit makers out of genocide and historically the occupation, that colleagues from several other Canadian universities, including Catherine Blouin at Toronto, a piece in Al Jazeera calling for Canadian institutions of higher education and universities to be included in the frame, because the report didn't talk about Canadian universities. And so that's definitely, a situation that I feel is very significant right now, that, how do we find places and ways to resist? And also this feeling that every institution is committed in its various ways, in the settler colonial context, in the Western context, to perpetuating a position in the world that is genocidal, that is wrong, and we're bound up in it. But what I do take solace in is that, as you pointed out, I'm interested in a number of different things, and in my work and in the work that I'm doing on my own show that I started just this last year, trying to mobilize knowledge, historical knowledge, for political education, and to have an outlet for creating a sense of community, in resistance. And the kind of work that I've been doing and that I'm interested in is looking at some of these deep histories. And it's interesting to be on a podcast that focuses more on the psychological and, that often, and this is so wonderful about your podcast and about your work and approach, that very often is very individualizing in this kind of modernist construct of the subject, and that is a part of this kind of Western philosophical orientation, and how it sees the self, as divorced and separate from, everything else. And then that can be used to isolate people from one another, to make them feel that they don't have a collective meaning, and to obscure structural analysis. So as somebody who's a historian and looks at the longue durée, over a long period of time, that's a wonderful balance. So I'm actually hoping maybe you might have some insights for how this long history interacts with the particular conditions of subject and self-formation, and the emotional psychodynamics that work themselves out in relation to the wider social context and this longer history. But basically, what I'm interested in terms of the Islamophobia question, and I'll stop there so we can either explore that further or go on to other subjects, is looking at the fact that racism has a longer history than just the construct of scientific racism and the discourse that we typically associate, with it as a modern phenomenon. And that isn't to say that it shares the same features or operates in exactly the same way, but that we have to have a longer sense of what I think is a very important transition from two things. One is changing basic ethno-linguistic and cultural characteristic that all peoples historically have developed as kinds of difference that, people in the pre-modern, say the Mediterranean world, were very aware of. They were aware that, some people wore turbans, other people, women covered their hair in a certain way. I mean, almost everybody did, but that they may have had different kind of foods, or very important, how did they wear their hair? Did they have beards or did they shave? Did they, have long hair? These were kind of like these simple kind of cultural ethnic markers, and you knew who was who and what was what by how they dressed and how they groomed. And it was, a line of difference, but it wasn't necessarily a problem, like in the cosmopolitan world of the Mediterranean, of the Middle East. And I think this is something that's very important, is that we've forgotten that the West Asia and North Africa were among the most diverse places you could possibly imagine, because they were crossroads of long histories of migration, of invasion, of trade, of travel. And so they're full of diversity. We often think of medieval Spain as some kind of, there's a book called Ornament of the World that was popular, was made into a documentary by I'm forgetting the name of the author. But her work was basically about how wonderful and exceptional medieval Spain was, Al-Andalus, under the Muslims, and then later under the Christians, because it was a place where there were Muslims, Christians, and Jews. And in fact, actually, as a historian of the medieval Mediterranean and the Islamic world, I would say it's not that exceptional. That's the whole rest of the world. There are Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and many varieties of them. What's exceptional is that Spain was the one place where Latin Catholics were part of it for any length of time. And then, of course, they're the ones who put an end to it with the Reconquista and the forced conversions and the Inquisition and, the expulsions and so on. And that history is the history of how the West comes to be the West, and how a country like Spain, or a land like Spain on the Iberian Peninsula, comes to be part of Europe, is that it has to accomplish this genocidal kind of ethnic cleansing and forced conversion for it to then be part of what becomes Europe, the Latin West, Latin Christendom. And so, to me, the roots of racism have to be looked at longer in the transition. The second major transition is religion into race. Okay, so where's the place of that ethnic difference? Does that become racialized and made as if it can't change, even though, those are factors, features, how people dress could easily be changed. Very simple. How does that become something that's made more immutable? And likewise, religion. How do people, the lines of difference that were very important in these societies of the medieval Mediterranean, was your religious affiliation and your identity there somehow, in the process of the transition into modernity, this shifts and it moves into a kind of conception of immutability, because of course religion can be changed and people can convert. And that was often a stated goal, like, oh, we want all these Jews and Muslims to convert. What happens when we force them to actually do it? Now we have to invent new lines of difference, and we end up with the limpieza de sangre, injunctions that biologize or genealogize the difference. That, oh, well, if you're an old Christian, then you're okay because you have genealogical purity of blood. And if you're a new Christian, i.e. somebody who was forcibly converted or whose recent ancestors were forcibly converted to Christianity, You're a new Christian and your blood is tainted because now we're all Christians. But how are we going to have hierarchy in our society? How are we going to exclude other people and dominate them and maintain hegemony? As well, it has to move from religious difference, which is still policed. Okay, you're bad Christians. That's why we need the Inquisition. The Inquisition was never for Jews and Muslims. It was for new Christians from Jewish backgrounds and Muslim backgrounds, the conversos as they were known, and the moriscos as they were known, the forcibly converted former Muslims. So, you're still going to be policed because you're bad Christians, and that's what the Inquisition was a surveillance state, was a mode of having neighbors rat on each other. These people are still adhering to these non-Christian, non-Orthodox Christian practices. But that wasn't itself enough, like there was a boundary that had to be created, which was who's an old Christian and a new Christian. This was biologized. And I think those are the roots in transition toward a more modern concept of race as an immutable biological entity. So my point here is that Islamophobia and anti-Semitism together were very foundational in this transition in the identity of the West as it forms itself, Latin Christendom, which will become Europe later, really, formed itself through thinking about religious difference that transforms into other forms of difference, and that there is a larger continuity to be studied between the relationship between religion and race that I think is still very, very important now in the kind of maybe post-biological racism era. And we are reminded of this longer history by seeing how it's very hard to classify, is Islamophobia just religious bigotry or is it a form of racism? I believe it is a form of racism that builds upon the historic characteristics of a religious regime that was then transformed and changed. But that's only possible really to see when you study the longer history and see these deeper structural transformations where the language may change. Some of the features of how this kind of form of exclusion operates may change, but that fundamentally the structure is the same of exclusion, of hierarchy, and of oppression. That is the long history, I would say, of Islamophobia as a form of racism, anti-Semitism as a form of racism, that has features that betray, I think, a longer and more complicated process, and that it's so constitutive for the West. That's why I think even today we could talk a little bit more about its manifestations today, but I think it just doesn't make sense. I mean, right now, I would argue that there is no politics in the West, no vision, no program, no project that really makes sense in the West as holding together these states as political, programs other than neo-colonial settler genocide and supporting it and complicity, and that its foundations rest upon a sense of Islamophobia. And that is not to say that it's only directed against Muslims. My understanding of Islamophobia in this long history and process and the way it was kind of co-determined with what changed in anti-Semitism, in fact, my argument is that it is the discovery of Islam and Muslims as an actual kind of rival to Christendom and to Christianity that changes the relationship to the Jews in Europe. They become, allies of the Muslims. They become a potential fifth column, and it transforms a historic anti-Jewish relationship. Christian anti-Judaism is, well known, late antiquity. It's really part of the roots of the development of this new religious religion, new religious culture, but that it transforms into the active, violent pogroms, genocide, blood libel, all these other features. The idea that Jews are Christ killers used to be that they blamed the Romans. Then they suddenly started really blaming the Jews specifically as deicides. This is all happening at exactly the same time as Europe is transforming itself through a Crusader war, and crusader mobilization, and really coming to recognize Islam as a rival to Christendom, or the Muslim world as a rival to Christendom, and that this transforms their relationship, to the Jews. So my point is this, that it's very hardwired into this long historical kind of development.
Oh my God, that. Thank you for this brief introduction, Adnan.
Sorry, it wasn't that brief. I should have been briefer.
There is so much to unpack in there. It's good. It's a good thing we have about 6 hours in front of us. Listening to you, some things came up for me. In the first part, I wanted to talk about the psychology of living in settler colonies, but maybe we'll get back to that before we finish. But on the other points, until I really came across your work, my vision of biological racism was that it first formed, I read some history that said it kind of first formed in France around the time of the revolution. Well, before the revolution, it was all to do with the needs of the colonialist economy in Santo Domingo and the slavery there. And suddenly the French settlers started to intermarry with African slave women, and then this new the mulattoes came up, and then there was a debate as to whether we could give them the rights of the slavers or whether they should stay slaves. And the king refused to consider black people as non-people. And so gradually this idea came that to make sure that the slaves wouldn't ally with the mulattoes and couldn't revolt, which was always a danger in those colonies because of the sheer numbers of, colonists versus slaves. There was a whole movement which was very strong in the counter-revolutionary movement around the time of the French Revolution that developed this idea that we needed to put biological barriers between, black people and white people. But what I'm hearing now, what I'm seeing now, listening to you and coming across these ideas, is that it probably was made possible by this long history of starting to reify, in a way, religion reify the way you wear your hair and the clothes you wear and all the rest of it. And another thing that came up when I was listening to you was the Spanish Inquisition. When you first mentioned it, I go to the Monty Python joke that goes, nobody expected the Spanish Inquisition. But actually, I think it's exactly the opposite. The Spanish Inquisition was necessary to get Spain kind of integrated into the emerging white Europe. Mm-hmm. And the Spanish Inquisition is still ongoing. This is what Meta and Google and Palantir are about. They are the new version of the Spanish Inquisition. And I'm kind of interested in your historian's view on whether that's a new Western idea that you kind of have to probe people's innermost thoughts and to straighten them out, because you even find it in some, in some of the most, how can I say this, dogmatic versions even of Marxism or whatever, these ideas of the thought crimes. Is that one of those great Western European inventions, the idea that you really have to police people's thoughts, or does it have a longer history? And another question, my God, my questions are so complicated. What's the articulation between anti-black racism and anti-Semitism and Islam racism?
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Three big questions. I want to start just with, because I think maybe the first and the third kind of go together a little bit. So, but let me take the second one, because I was talking towards, and talking about medieval Spain and the things I'm interested there about the Inquisition and about how that is a kind of genealogy or forerunner or preparatory set of conditions for the surveillance state. And I think you're absolutely right that there is some kind of link in terms of governance of populations that is there with the new technologies and the way in which the genius of the modern or postmodern or whatever it is we're in, let's just call it the genocide era, kind of self-reporting, that we all provide all of this, by participating in these forums and platforms, is that we provide all this kind of information about ourselves quite willingly. I remember when Skype first came on, people can't even remember probably Skype, the first kind of video calling and all of that. And I would see, sometimes it says when you're online, it's green, and other people can see when you're online and when you're not, unless you close it or do something. And I thought, this is just a wonderful way. And I thought Facebook the same. We're all just telling everybody about everything, and who knows what the company does with this data. And why is it that I posted about one thing about, say a new shirt or something, and then now I'm getting all these ads for clothing, and it's like,
I get Asian children doing this, like on my Instagram, Asian children doing this. Apparently, I like that a lot, So,
yeah, right. Well, well, this is what you have lots of material for psychoanalysis. Actually, this is kind of like their probing of our inner lives, just as you were saying, right? I mean, of how we can manifest our inner lives through our preferences, through our lives, and through sharing with our friends, that it's like they're watching all of this, and then they're able with these new and powerful tools to try and conduct a kind of information war upon us, right? And this is propaganda, it's marketing, it's all these kinds of things. And I do think in some ways it relies upon an ancient historical problem of governance, of how do rulers govern. And so I think that the particular form of it may be a kind of Western invention. Again, another one of these, geniuses of Western civilization to invent the inner life that can be colonized or probed or, but I wouldn't say it's only that. It's just its particular forms. Like nobody else developed an inquisitorial structure and regime. And there are reasons why there are specifics to what happened in the Latin West, perhaps, that would give clues to how it constructed a kind of sense of communal identity and of doctrinal. Once it tried, until 1215, some people argue, the Lateran IV Council, you didn't really have Christianity in Europe. You had Christians, you had Christian religious, there were monks, there were priests, there were all this apparatus, but the rest of the people, what did it really mean to be, there were some minimal things, but what actually was instituted in 1215 was you have to go to confession once a year.
Right.
Okay? You have to attend mass once a year, and you have to do confession once a year. And
see, I thought you were describing Australia before you went on with the confession thing, because that's what Australia was like. You just would say Anglican, even though you never went to church, you never,
Well, that's it. Like our post-religious secular world is maybe a lot like, in some aspects for common everyday people, like the pre-moderns, like in the sense that there wasn't a lot of heavy requirements on your participation, on your engagement, on your belief. Who cared whether some peasant believed, that was well, what are you going to do? Those people are meaningless anyway. The people you care about is recruiting for the monasteries and so on. And you just want them not to cause trouble, pay their tithe, and so on. And respect the church, even if you couldn't be that concerned with somebody's inner belief. But what starts to happen is once you legislate and you try and expand what it means to be a Christian to the rest of society, include the laity in this, now you've created new problems for yourself. And this is where heresy emerges, because people respond to it in counterways with their own kind of feelings and thoughts and their own interpretations and their own practices. And that then requires the church to make a response. We have to stamp out the heresy. How do we know heretics keep their things secret? How can we get access to what they're really thinking and believing? Oh, we'll use violence and torture and modes of interrogation, and we will monitor, we will recruit people to report on their neighbors, if somebody's a heretic or if they're still adhering to Christian or Jewish practices. Are they not eating pork? Are they not, they're taking a bath on Thursday night or Friday morning because they are still respecting the Friday as the holy day? Are they, they doing, are you hearing them still using Arabic and, reciting Quran? So report on one another, and you have the foundations on kind of social paranoia.
So religious surveillance is like the onset of the surveillance. You know what I mean? Like it started with religious surveillance.
And
then, Foucault.
And then it makes you want to piss off and settle somewhere else, right? Just to escape the pressure of it all.
Well, that's it. Settler colonialism. Coming to the other topic, maybe at least briefly what you were saying, there is a connection, obviously, between marginalized and oppressed populations in Europe and settler colonial populations. Like this is a solution to the problem of what do you do with these radical Puritans who are rejecting, the established order, rejecting the church. Well, you can turn them into useful, productive, citizens, by settling them elsewhere to establish colonial societies and do something useful, something useful. And for them, it's escape. They can build their vision of the utopian society. So, of course, the United States, why wouldn't the United States be so totally committed to the settler colonial project of Zionism when they were building the New Jerusalem themselves in the 17th and 18th centuries, when their radical religious and millenarian, apocalyptic sort of visions couldn't be integrated into the rational politics of, say, the British state, right, the UK state, or you have Huguenots. And there was a kind of sense that, if you were part of one of these Protestant Protestant religious movements, you might not be loyal to your state and your king, or there was some question. And this is the whole religious wars in Europe were trying to resolve territorial and political and religious identity. One land, one king, one religion, if possible. That was what was ideal, but that's what was tearing Europe apart. Is in these mixed places where you had mixed communities under one political sovereignty, this was seen as impossible. How could you have that? They wouldn't be loyal. Protestant rulers thinking that if we have Catholics, they're loyal to a transnational, unity and the church beyond our control. And that's a problem of politics. And so, there was an outlet for this by, sending them to the New World or other worlds or other places to be settler colonists, I mean, that's not the only motive for, these populations, that's not necessarily.
It was possible, right? Because you said that in the Middle East, like they were living side by side, right? So it's interesting that the Europeans.
Well, Europe
it's
had
not
this
possible,
problem,
right? Yeah.
Europe had this problem because it was creating national identities and nationalism, which has been a complete disaster when imposed upon the Middle East in the modern world order of nation states. All these problems that we have of people stranded without a nation state, the Kurds or minority populations, ethno-religious minority populations in nation states that are being kind of coded as one particular identity. So, what do you do with Armenians, in Turkey? Because Turkey, we all have to be Turks, and what that means is we're going to speak Turkish, be Muslim. That's what it meant to really be a Turk, So these new constructions of national identities and the ideology of nationalism that was really imposed upon the Middle East with the breakup of these multi-ethnic, multi-religious empires, land-based empires, which are very different from what we talk about as colonial empires and imperialism, which is really a nation state that goes and colonizes others. So the British Empire, I don't even like to call it the British Empire because it makes it seem like it's the Ottoman Empire or the Russian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it operated totally differently. It was a nation state where the people of English background in particular were privileged above everyone else. The national identity was predicated on that. And wherever else they colonized, they had, colonial populations who, through a racial regime, could never be incorporated into the polity at a kind of a level of something like citizenship or being part of the governing class, which is what happened in these other older land-based empires. I mean, what did it mean to be an Ottoman? I mean, who ruled? There was a sultan who nominally was from this dynasty, this Turkic people's dynasty, with intermarried with Byzantines and, so many, like all royal houses, they made alliances and they incorporated people from all over. So what did it mean that they were Turkish? I mean, that didn't mean much, but actually who ruled the empire? Well, they were all these people that were recruited forcibly or not from the provinces, especially the Balkans. And, they had to become Muslim, but then they could be the Grand Vizier. It could be somebody from Serbia who was captured in fact, actually, interesting spot in Istanbul that I like to stay in is near this Kılıç Ali Pasha Mosque. And Kılıç Ali Pasha was like the basically admiral of the Ottoman navies in like the 16th century, I believe. And his original name was Giovanni. He was like an Italian seafarer and a young man, very young. Maybe he was like teens. He was captured. He converted to Islam because he's now in the Ottoman Empire, and he rose up to the ranks and becomes the admiral. That could happen in this cosmopolitan, diverse, pluralistic world where, yes, there is hierarchy and there is inclusion and exclusion based on religion and religious identity, but it was seen as, well, okay, just become a Muslim. You become a Muslim and you can rise up. It wasn't this kind of idea that you have an immutable difference that has to be subordinated, and excluded in order to privilege only a narrow kind of racialized dominant class.
But that's fascinating because the etymology of the word slave comes from Slav, right? It's the same etymology, and those were people that were actually captured by Ottomans and stuff, and for a while were
well, actually, earlier, that's a medieval experience.
Right.
Is that like the raids? Okay, so you were not supposed to enslave fellow Christians.
Right.
Well, helpfully, for Charlemagne and others, like right on their borderland. Well, first there was with the Saxons, but then, other polities in Eastern Europe, there were populations that were still non-Christianized. And so they could be, attacked, conquered, enslaved, and sold, right? So this is kind of where you're absolutely right, that it comes from the name of these peoples who were open to being made unfree, and then their labor being sold, for their labor, and that's where.
But that was potentially a transitional state is where I'm getting at. Whereas with slavery of black people in white societies, you could never not be a slave. Like there was the biologization or the reification of the status, right? Is that correct?
Yes. That's what's different and unique about kind of modern, you would call, forms of slavery in the Atlantic world. And I think there's a real connection between the experience of the Latin West, of Latin Christendom in the Mediterranean world, confronting Muslims in particular in North Africa, in the Mediterranean world. And for many, generations, if you look, you can see this. My colleague Ariel Salzman really works on this sort of stuff, the enduring image of the Moor as a black African slave. Okay, that's kind of the early history of it. And you have a lot of images of it. You have sculpture, you have, painting and so on, of this kind of stereotyped idea of the Moor in chains and figured typologically as a black African. And so this is already an experience that is exported into the Atlantic world because of raiding on the coast of West Africa. And establishes then a racial divide where slavery becomes an inherited status due to race. You can be born easily into slavery, and it's a different kind of model of enslavement based upon biological race, or a construct of biological race that is different from the historic, terrible, oppressive, regime of exploitation of labor, ownership of humans. But that was a very different kind of way in which it was organized in history. So some scholars historically draw a distinction between societies with slavery, which are many, most of slave societies historically had some kind of form of slavery, domestic slavery, and so on, with slave societies. That is, societies where the institution of slavery as a form of organizing labor in its economy, that you cannot describe that society without understanding that institution, that it really is so significant in forming a certain kind of dynamic and structure to society built around the institution of slavery. And so you have domestic slavery, you have sort of household type slavery, but plantation slavery is a new phenomenon for Europe that it had forgotten since Roman times. Right, the Romans were a slave society, but then they had serfdom and a lot of other social changes, and you couldn't describe it quite as a slave society. But then their settler colonies in the Atlantic world are built around this idea of biologically based slavery in the settler societies of the New World.
One thing we're really focused on is this process of dehumanization. And listening to you, I'm kind of wondering, where does dehumanization come from? And I'm kind of guessing probably more likely coming from slave societies than from societies with slavery, in which, you can be a slave for a while and then be freed, or even reach some kind of status in a given political economy. Is that the way you also see it from your studies?
Or does it come from confusion or something? Like, I imagine when they first rock up and they meet someone with a different color skin that does things a different way, and they don't want to feel insecure or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, then they go, the other, and that's not me. And
yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It's hard to know. See, these are like the great questions that people who are interested in how people perceive things, and what that dynamic internally, and those motivations and operations, that's harder for me to really grasp, because I notice things like war making and slave taking are very closely connected. So whatever are the impelling conditions and motivations for war making also involve the dehumanization that justifies that those who are captured, right? So in this time, pre-modern time, there's no real way you could organize major imprisoned populations, right? You just don't have the infrastructure. You don't have prisons that are this large to control. It's very difficult to control large groups of people. Like, you may have defeated them, they surrender. What do you do with them? Right. Well, sometimes what you could do with them was, kill the men. They're likely to be a danger. They could rise up in revolt, and then distribute the women and children as spoils for domestic household type slavery. But then they started developing other institutions like, we could create plantations. We could create, enterprises like building the pyramids or things like that, and control this population and use them for their labor. You weren't going to warehouse people. That's expensive. Who has the resources to feed and clothe and maintain and guard? So these big infrastructural labor projects, were often slave labor, right? Enslaved labor. And so I think warfare and enslavement on a large scale and having to create new structures seem to go together. And the dehumanization, I don't know. What comes first? The dehumanization that means I will kill you, capture you, or enslave you, or see you as worthy of that, or if war and conflict, because of these sorts of forces happen, and then you develop ideologies around how to explain and justify, the subordination of others in a long-term and brutal sort of way. It's very hard for me to say what's the origin,
See, I don't think you have to dehumanize people to go to war with them, but I think to enslave them, you probably have to, right? But I think to go to war with people, I don't think you have to dehumanize them. Because
you would have to. Yeah, I think you're right that this is why it's important to make distinctions between kinds of slavery, because domestic household slavery and where people could it was a mode of labor. It was just really a labor organ. You fall into debt, you could be a debt slave. You are captured in war, you could be, these kinds of things could happen. And in a world, in some of these worlds, you work your, even indentured servitude, was a kind of adaptation of the same kind of idea. You work for a certain number of years. You're a loyal, kind of useful kind of worker or agent for a merchant. And then you can, purchase your freedom, because you could still own property or gain property and so on. So certain kinds of things for the modern kind of slavery that we're much more familiar with because of its importance in United States, in the Caribbean, in the Western Hemisphere. You're right. That is a much more totalizing regime because it's built around this sense of biological racial difference that does require this dehumanization as part of the racial ideology, I think. Yeah.
But not everyone, but also not everyone in the society has to dehumanize. For some reason, I'm thinking about serial killers because my PhD's in forensic psychology. And, different serial killers will look at victims differently. Some will say victim as an object and they'll completely dehumanize. Some will want the victim as a person because they want intimacy or they want, do you know what I mean, out of their crime. It depends what the motivation for their crime is. So if you think about a society, it could be not everyone in that society has to dehumanize. And if you think about how some people started marrying the slaves, they must have started to humanize them, right? To then fall in love with them or marry, just naturally maybe or whatever. But
and there we find exactly the debates that, happened in France before and during and right after the French Revolution around whether you could intermarry, whether the people who intermarried, who came out of these intermarriages with slaves in the French colonies, could accede to civil rights. And the French Revolution itself, what became known as the left later, was to give rights to everybody. But you had this class of settlers who fought against it. And there, this is, going back to the point you just made earlier. And then you go back to this conflation of what is going to help a particular political economy develop and become hegemonic, and the ideology that serves it. And clearly, there was this conflation. You gave the historical roots, and around the time of the Industrial Revolution, there was this marriage made in not heaven but hell between, supremacy, dehumanization of the other, and this emerging colonial capitalism, which is still with us today, and I think is at the ideological and political economic root of everything. And I'm trying to be really subtle here because I wanted to segue our conversation into your way of bringing together Islam and Marxism and how you see the articulation. So I don't know if I managed to do this in a very elegant way, but I was mindful of the time, and I wanted to pick your brain on this because when I heard the podcast, I found it absolutely fascinating. So,
well, thanks so much for raising that. And there's so much, of course, to talk about what we've been and, many other directions. I hope we'll get a chance and to do so at some point in the future. But I really am interested in this kind of question. And I think particularly to speak with you both on your podcast about this, because I see I've had some good conversations with a former co-host of ours on Guerrilla History, Brett O'Shea from Revolutionary Left Radio, and we had a good conversation a few months ago on my channel, on my show, about Marxian mysticism and left spirituality, and what is the place of trying to reconcile things that we think of as very counter to materialism, and have been exploited in the past very much for kind of right-wing formations of subjugation and so on, or mystifying like reality and the politics, right, of the real world. So how does that go with a materialist kind of analysis of social and economic forces and their political consequences? It seems like, well, these would be very incompatible discourses. And of course, historically, in the emergence of what we think of as the left, of socialism, of communism, and so on, in Europe, it was very hostile to religion. Marx has those famous, opiate of the masses and so on. And so historically, all these movements have targeted the conservative forces and the ideational dimensions and the non-materialist analysis or the non-materialist orientation of religion as like actually dangerous to real liberatory struggle, because you have to, free yourself from these delusions, right? Or these ideological confusions in order to actually see reality. But I think there was something interesting that Marx even said in that quote, which is that religion is the cry of the oppressed, right? So, okay, it may sort of fantasize a deferral and delay of changing the world that we're living in, to suffer in patience with oppression that exists for a future reality of salvation or redemption. And that's the politically problematic part, for Marx, is that it prevents people from engaging in investing in change in the world. But what he said was that it was the cry of the oppressed. I mean, there is something real in the experience that religion gives voice to the complaints about the world, right? So that there is an analysis that the world isn't the way it should be. It's unjust. It's, oppressive. It's unfair, all of this. But so I think that there is still something there that's valuable in religion. And for me, what I'm interested in is less the cosmology of the metaphysics, right, of it, of like, all of that. But for the experience of the person, how do you realize your full humanity? And it seems to me there is a need for some emotional, I call it spiritual kind of growth and development. There may be other discourses and languages that you would have, availability with, that are along the same lines of how do you align yourself? How do you have a discipline and a formation to really grow as a person in a world that's full of threat, challenge, oppression, injustice, all these things that are challenges and that themselves, turn inward, that you can be harmful to yourself. You can harm those who, love you with, dynamics that, somehow channel negatively the fact that we are surrounded by forces that affect us negatively. And how do you deal with that? What are the ways in which you can, because it just seems to me that resistance is not a short-term commitment. How can you have what I think was it Cornel West said, you want to be a long distance runner for justice. It's like you have to have the training and the discipline and the resources to somehow stay committed, for a long-term struggle. It's a lifetime struggle. We want to be effective, but we realize we have to develop some of these resources to survive this and stay committed and stay engaged, not fall into despair or withdraw. And so I find that despite the fact that mysticism and spirituality have often been ways of withdrawing from active engagement in the world, that for me, there is a kind of way in which it is tapping into resources to maintain some kind of balance and commitment, to integrate the inner and the outer, the inner struggles that we have with ourselves, to be better people, to deal with things, to not succumb to, negative or thoughts, self-doubts, in the wrong way that debilitate us, etc., and also be active and engaged in the world and committed to a vision of, health for people at all levels, mentally, socially. I do think that there is some kind of spiritual crisis, if we want to call it, happening, that people are struggling for some kind of meaning in this
humanity crisis, right? Like a humanity, I think of it like the Hamas humanity test, right? Like that, but the people that are sort of closing their eyes are going to suffer later, in my opinion. But it's interesting because as you're talking, I'm thinking, because that's what I started to realize before all this stuff, where I started to sort of put it together, like if I'm not careful as a psychologist, I could end up like therapy serves the same function as some of those religions, right? Like it's like just therapy could be used to pacify you. I started to have this thought, and it was like, am I just helping people deal with their own like economic slavery? Like that's essentially my job. And I mean, the thought I had today was like, you do realize my job would not be needed if our society was running in a healthy way. You wouldn't need me for my job. The only reason you need me is because they create the problems that I then have to, and then I started realizing I'm just putting out fires, man. I'd rather go to the source of the fire, the people starting the fire, white empire or whatever, right? But when it comes to the activity stuff, it's like say something like mindfulness, it depends on the function. Like if you're doing it to just feel good about yourself and it's this narcissistic thing, that's the pacification thing. Like they try and divert you into that and just do it narcissistically, just appreciate, or like just take from nature and appreciate nature narcissistically, as opposed to being mindful about propaganda. And, so I started looking at how the therapy model that I use can be used to unpack propaganda and defuse from propaganda. So if you're using mindfulness to watch mainstream media, that's a much more healthier, resistance-focused sort of mindfulness. But yes, Benji, I know you're dying to say something.
I always am. My son calls it yapping. As I'm listening to you guys, I'm going, maybe that idea of making compatible Marxism, material analysis of history and the economy and religion, and a more spiritual approach to life, to the mysteries of existence, is a peculiarly Western problem, and probably a peculiar problem of that totalizing mind of the Spanish Inquisition, if you want to call it that way, because in a sense, as you say, religion can lead you to quietism, to not doing anything, or it can lead you to support the national liberation struggle, like we're seeing very strongly in Palestine today, or it can lead you into those, cultish dead ends, as we're seeing with some of those apocalyptic Zionist cults or Wahhabi cults. So they're just different planes in a way, they're different ways, and they don't cancel out one another. You can look at religion with a kind of materialist perspective. So what kind of forces does that do? But you can also look at Marxism. There's a very strong argument made by Lucerdo and others that Western Marxism is a kind of, has led people to retreat into a kind of contemplative state where you read all those books and you have all those great analysis, but you actually do nothing about the world. And when you read Marxist thinkers and the Marxist doers from the global South, they don't actually have those kinds of problems that much. They use it as a tool, but they put it in its own place. They don't go, oh, okay, this will explain my own culture in Africa since the beginning of time, or this will negate my 3,000 years of civilization country as they do in China. So I think it's maybe a peculiar problem of the Western mind where we go, oh, no, science is going to solve the final mysteries of the universe. It's naive. It's childish in a way, It's going to help us navigate that big mystery hopefully better over time. And so the same with, political science or historical science or dialectical materialism, it does what it does where it does it, but it also needs to know its place. And we can look at religion in the same way and go, there is something when you look at Palestine, the Palestinian movement, and the role of religion in people's steadfastness and sumud. As a Marxist, I don't see myself, and I don't even understand the argument that would be to go, yeah, your movement is great, but you have this kind of weird obscurantist illusion. You should shed this and you'll be much better. It makes no material sense to think in that way, right?
I agree completely. And the conclusion of my conversation with Brett O'Shea actually did talk a little bit about what resources and resilience, religious faith, meant for Palestinians in resistance, and that it's impossible really to ignore and yet, like a lot of people, on the left, as you're saying, either, have this kind of conflicted relationship to that because they don't quite know how should we think about it. Either it's, well, we should condemn that aspect of it or somehow bracket it and just not pay attention to that as a real genuine factor, in the sumud, the resilience, the ability to maintain a culture of resistance, a society in resistance for what seems and feels like impossibly long, that it's been almost 2 years and yet they're still maintaining resistance. I mean, this is like, if I want to use the language of religion, I'd say this is like miraculous. Like, how are these people still managing to find the inner resources to insist upon living, insist upon resisting? It's absolutely amazing. But I think even, you mentioned, Benji, these, global South activists and intellectuals did not seem always to have the same kind of hang-ups about how to resolve or reconcile these things. It reminds me that even, for example, if you watch the Battle of Algiers, this is made to be the resistance film par excellence of the anti-colonial struggle of the late 50s and 60s, right? And the FLN, fighting against French settler colonialism. You think of it as a very secular struggle, the way it's portrayed, in the historiography on the left about resistance. And of course, Fanon doesn't spend a lot of time talking about theologies of, liberation theologies and so on. Although he does talk about psychology, and people don't really talk enough, I think, about his sense of the psychology in like that chapter on mental disorders. But that's a separate conversation one could have, and I'm not the best to have it. But if you look at, even in that movie, there were like little glimpses of a culture of resistance in the FLN. Like, for example, the marriage ceremony that takes place between these two young members of the FLN. And it's like a religious ceremony, but it's got adaptations that also connect it with the national struggle. And to my mind, we are ignoring something that's very important: the cultural resources, the spiritual and religious and psychological resources that are necessary to actually promote effective resistance over the long term. And if we just think it's about ideological commitment to the cause of freedom and, there's injustice, I think we are missing. And the right wing actually is so much better at implementing its vision of horrific oppression, racism, injustice, sadism, into the, fabric of cultural aspects. They're so much more comfortable doing that in perverting culture for their hideous, ends. And I think actually we need to combat at every level. And some of that means recognizing and valuing aspects of anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistance in, say, for example, the global South that doesn't necessarily share exactly the same, kind of divorcing of, or doesn't see the contradictions always in exactly the same way, if we're to really be in solidarity with these movements. And I guess I would just say that as a last thing on this is that I read a wonderful piece a few years ago in the Black Agenda report by what was the name? Jonas Manoel, who wrote a piece called "Western Marxism Loves Purity and Martyrdom, but Not Real Revolution." And what he looked at is that it's like a kind of Christian monastic order, being a leftist in the West. And, purity, i.e., we disagree with them on this one thing. Okay, we can't work with them. We can't collaborate. We're not going to be an effective force that maintains our principles, but works, to actually collectively. No, we'll, prioritize ideological purity over everything. And we don't necessarily have to be effective. We're happy to be martyrs and suffer that, we're in the right, but like the rest of the world, doesn't recognize, that we're for their truth, liberation, and justice. And, so we'll be martyrs to the cause. And the struggle is more important than that it actually achieve anything or be effective. Right? This was his critique, and I found it, and he based it so much on a culture of Christianity. And it shows that every kind of liberation movement, Western Marxism, has in it some of the elements of Christian culture structurally. Even if it's jettisoned all the ideology, all the rituals, there's structurally something there. And so likewise, why would we expect that liberation movements in the global South should be some cookie cutter version of exactly what we've developed, in societies of the West? They're going to have to create something that speaks meaningfully to their culture, their environment, and is still dedicated towards liberation, freedom, and justice. So I thought it's a great point. And I find, for myself and in these conversations that I'm trying to develop, and others have had interesting thoughts on this, and there's a long history of, people like Sultan Mir Galiev, who was, from Crimea, and he was early 20th century Muslim Marxist who thought, there's got to be some way that these anti-colonial movements in the Muslim world could connect with, Leninism and the Russian Revolution. And so there have been attempts in the past. It's just that we don't really know about them or think about them, but that I see a lot of potential in trying to develop, because whatever you want to say, Muslims, you're not going to recruit them at this stage in history after they've gone through Arab socialism and so on and been crushed. You're not going to convince them that, you just have to abandon Islam and become like a Western, secular Marxist. But I think there's a lot of potential, for liberation, that the pathway that the Palestinians are showing forward could have, important consequences and effects for rethinking for this generation what it means to be a Muslim and an anti-imperialist, and to, see, it's all so clear now, like the form of Islam that has been appropriated by, as you were saying, these cultish, extremist Wahhabi Salafist groups. You can see it plays right into the hands of empire, of Zionism, of the Greater Israel Project. So what are the alternatives? And that's something that's interesting to think about, and something that I'm always working on. And so I'm introducing also on my channel a new series with a friend and a colleague who is a phenomenological psychologist. So looking at the experience of things rather than say the theology and the theosophy, but first work with the experience and how that's been understood, to talk about the divine names, right? Okay, the 99 names of God, which is a tradition, devotional and spiritual tradition in Islamic mysticism, spirituality, and theology, and so on, to try and kind of develop what are some resources for spiritual development within this tradition that remain or fuel or strengthen us in our political resistance as well. So that's the kind of thing we're launching that I hope is a resource to other communities of people who I think have lacked some of those resources, but have something fundamental in their position because of Islamophobia, because they're in West Asia, which has been the kind of site for 40, 50, 60 years of imperial invasion, suppression, and hegemony through the Zionist project and through U.S. invasions, that it's a very fertile ground for resistance. It's happening there. And what are the resources that are available in that vocabulary, in their tradition, that can be used effectively to continue resistance, for the sake of liberation and justice?
I think you just took me full circle, because at the start you were talking about, the co-workers that how do I deal with these co-workers? How do I defend this institution? And then right at the end, you're like, well, I'm gathering all the resources to help resistance, right? Like, that's how I deal with it, right?
Well, I have to see what I'm doing as doing something useful. Like that's like, I'm less concerned with the politics of the institution and what can I use it now while we still have this time, while I'm still employed, while the university still exists. To some extent, you can still do some humanities, social sciences. They're trying to kill it, cut it. But while we have it, what can we do that's actually meaningful and interesting for this cause, Yeah.
And one aspect in what you said, Adnan, that was very present for me as you were speaking is, this idea that it's very hard to see outside of your own context, outside of your own culture. So, as Westerners, as Marxists or whatever, we can have this tendency to think, okay, our cultural baggage, but they're kind of our roots also in a way. We imagine that they can just, grow anywhere without realizing that it's going to be the same for any community, for any nation, that they also have their own cultural roots. They also have their own connection to the past, to previous generations. And if you don't ground your project in something like this, then it's simply not going to take deep roots. It doesn't have roots, and it's going to be very easily uprooted. And I think this is what we saw in some of those, as you said, cookie cutter versions of Western Marxism that were tried to be imposed on Islamic countries and in other places. And you need to have a more indigenous movement that can then use that particular tool to their own ends and in their own way. And to me, when I go the longue durée approach also, and I step back, it also tells me that the resistance can only win because on the other side, you have people who are totally rootless. We have no identity. I've now been living in this settler colony for 14 years. I'm autistic, so I don't interact that much with people, but, still I keep abreast of the culture and stuff. And you can see how rootless everything is. And the genocide in Palestine, the acceleration of genocide in Palestine, to me, but I think to many people also, has kind of had this function, this effect of tearing apart the veil. And now I can barely live in this place. Everywhere I go, I see ghosts. Everywhere I go, I see rape. I see stolen land. I was in Vancouver last weekend and I went to the waterfront and it was ugly as sin. My partner said, no, sin is better than this. But literally I was thinking, this is Tel Aviv waterfront. I was going, well, I'm actually in Israel. I'm actually in a successful, whatever the hell that means, settler colony. But there is nothing, apart from this implanted high rises, franchises, and what the hell have you, there is nothing there. I mean, there's a couple of sculptures that look indigenous, but it's all for show. There's nothing there. So I don't see how this dehumanizing, and even, transhumanizing society, because they hate humanity so much, culture can win. And if they do win, it's the end of humanity.
I really hope you're right. And in fact, actually, in the introduction to this first episode on the divine names, I did set the frame is that this is about trying to understand what it means to be human within these terms, and that is under such threat in this time. Transhumanism, AI, the rise again of a kind of colonial racism where our lives are dispensable and valueless, and so humanity and human dignity is under assault, and it is so difficult, as you're saying, to deal with. I feel like you very often that how can I keep living in this society? You see what's around you is as you're saying, built upon these foundations of genocidal violence. They don't have deep roots here as these kind of, separated colonies of the West that are, building in this kind of malignant tumor sort of way, as kind of expansion, growth, and all of that. But it's not, organic to the environment, to the culture that was here. It was not built in any kind of balance with nature and with the peoples. This is a real problem. I mean, I do want to say that I don't think that the previous, that were very successful Marxist movements, the Two-Day Party in Iran, and all of these were completely implanted. They're not. They did result from popular movements because there was hope in those eras that a post-colonial future might be possible, and they were inspired by the great example of other revolutionary movements, and they found it fruitful and useful, but they were all crushed. They were absolutely crushed. And perhaps what that means is both that, facing empire, and during the Cold, War, these were crushed. We know what happened in Indonesia to the Marxist, kind of movements and left socialist movements there, so much slaughter, because the West will always support the so-called Oriental despot when it serves the purpose of eradicating these liberatory, egalitarian sorts of movements, and then blame them. Well, they're just brutal dictators. They don't really understand democracy. But what I would say is that subsequently people have had to turn to other resources that might have been kind of deeply embedded in their societies for the longue durée of resistance, because it's not going to happen quickly, that in 5-10 years we just, we'll get a workers' party in Saudi Arabia, and it's going to overturn, kind of this corrupt, pro-Western, authoritarian regime that's implanted there for the one purpose, sole purpose of oppressing and suppressing, the population, and ensuring that the great resources and wealth of the region are not shared out for popular sovereign development, but only for, a rich, corrupt elite, and to circulate into the global capital, economic system. So it's not going to, those forces are so huge. It's not going to happen in the short term. So the quick fix of, well, we just create a socialist, future, and we've got the program and the plan and the platform, we just read Lenin, what is to be done? Let's do it. Okay, that's not going to work. Now they've learned that. But what is the basis for which liberatory, egalitarian futures for the human being may be possible? People are going to have to develop those, and they have cultural resources available to them in the cultures of resistance of the global South. And I think we just have to learn, as Western people living in the West, is how do we be in solidarity with all of these, because it's going to require solidarity across everywhere. So anyway, what you just were saying about that just really touched, sparked something. I think this is the kind of conversation that's really needed, to have more of, thinking through these kinds of things. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have spent some time having some of these conversations with you today.
It's great to have you on.
Yeah, so do I. Where can people find you? You're involved in so many projects now. Can you just give us a
Sure.
few words
People can find
about
me,
them?
of course, still on Twitter /X. I still like to call it Twitter at Adnan A Husain, ADNAN AHUSAIN, and I post what I'm doing. But you might be interested in my YouTube channel and podcast, The Adnan Husain Show at Adnan Husain Show. And of course, I'm co-host of Guerrilla History. We're constantly putting out content there. And if you want to support the project, I mean, I have a great producer. You have had him as a guest on your show, East of the Podcast, Sina Rahmani, to support the project and so that I can be fair with my producer. You can support the project and go to patreon.com/Adnan Husain. Thanks so much.
Anything that supports Sina's ability to rant into the void, we're all for it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Adnan. Thank you for the great conversation. Thank you again for being so inspiring to us when we weren't even sure we would speak publicly. And I hope this is the first of many, many conversations with you.
I hope so. Inshallah, as they say.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.